Have you ever noticed that some people act completely confident right up until the moment you begin pulling away? They may have ignored your feelings for months, dismissed your concerns, or made you question your own reality. But the instant you stop chasing them, everything changes. Suddenly they become attentive. They send unexpected messages. They act kinder than usual. Sometimes they even promise to become the person you've been asking them to be all along. Most people assume this happens because toxic individuals finally realize your value. But that's rarely the real reason. Here's what almost nobody realizes. Toxic people often aren't afraid of losing just anyone. They're afraid of losing someone who consistently gave them emotional stability, patience, understanding, and second chances. In other words, they're afraid of losing an empath, not because they suddenly learn to appreciate them, but because they recognize what they stand to lose. Human behavior follows predictable patterns. Every relationship creates emotional habits, and when someone becomes dependent on another person's emotional energy, they often don't recognize that dependence until it's threatened. That's when hidden fears begin to surface. Have you ever wondered why someone who seemed emotionally distant suddenly becomes desperate when you stop reacting? Why they suddenly remember your worth only after you've become emotionally unavailable? Or why they appear calm while secretly panicking beneath the surface? The answers aren't as simple as love or attachment. They're rooted in psychology, emotional conditioning, behavioral reinforcement, and the way people respond when control begins slipping away. By the end of this video, you'll understand why toxic people often fear losing an empath far more than they ever admit, the hidden psychological mechanisms driving their behavior, and how recognizing these patterns can completely change the way you approach relationships. Because once you understand what's really happening beneath the surface, you'll stop taking their behavior personally. And that's where your real power begins. Today's topic is why toxic people fear losing an empath more than they admit. One of the biggest psychological misunderstandings in relationships is believing that everyone fears losing people for the same reason. Healthy individuals usually fear losing genuine connection, shared experiences, and mutual trust. Toxic individuals, however, often fear losing something very different. They fear losing access to emotional stability that someone else has been quietly providing. An empath naturally notices emotional shifts. They sense tension before words are spoken, offer reassurance without being asked, and frequently absorb emotional burdens that don't belong to them. At first, this generosity feels like kindness. Over time, however, it can become an invisible system where one person gives far more emotional energy than they receive. Here's what most people completely miss. The toxic person may never openly acknowledge how much they rely on that emotional support. In fact, they may criticize it, take it for granted, or even mock it. But psychologically, they begin adapting to a relationship where someone is constantly repairing emotional damage for them. They stop regulating themselves because someone else is doing it. This creates a powerful dependency. Think about someone who constantly starts arguments, but expects the other person to calm everything down afterward. They explode emotionally, disappear for a while, then return expecting understanding instead of accountability. The empath often becomes the emotional reset button without even realizing it. Now imagine that reset button suddenly disappears. The toxic person isn't simply facing loneliness. They're facing emotions they've avoided managing for years. Anxiety becomes louder. Frustration lasts longer. Insecurity becomes impossible to ignore because the person who quietly absorbed those emotions is no longer available. Have you ever noticed how someone who once seemed completely independent suddenly becomes restless after you stop responding? That's rarely random behavior. It's often the first sign that they were emotionally leaning on you much more than they ever admitted even to themselves. A practical lesson here is to observe patterns instead of promises. Don't ask whether someone says they value you. Ask yourself whether they consistently respect your emotional boundaries without expecting you to fix every conflict. Healthy relationships distribute emotional responsibility. Toxic ones quietly assign it to one person. This distinction changes everything because it shifts your focus from words to behavioral patterns. And once emotional dependence begins breaking apart, another hidden psychological process starts revealing itself, one that explains why toxic people often mistake empathy for permanent availability. That's exactly what we'll explore next. One of the most dangerous psychological blind spots in unhealthy relationships is the belief that someone who always forgives will always stay. Toxic people rarely make this assumption overnight. It develops slowly through repeated experiences where the empath continues giving chances, even after being disappointed. Behavioral psychology explains this through reinforcement. When a behavior repeatedly produces the same outcome, the brain begins to expect that outcome as normal. If every apology, whether sincere or not, is accepted, if every broken promise is eventually overlooked, and if every period of distance is followed by reconciliation, the toxic person unconsciously learns a powerful lesson. No matter what happens, this person isn't going anywhere. This isn't always a calculated strategy. In many cases, it's an unconscious expectation built over time. The relationship becomes predictable. They assume the empath's compassion has no limit. But here's where it gets interesting. Empaths don't usually leave during the biggest argument. They leave after hundreds of smaller moments where they feel unseen, unheard, and emotionally exhausted. Every dismissed feeling, every broken commitment, and every one-sided conversation slowly drains the emotional reserve that once seemed endless. Imagine someone who repeatedly cancels plans, minimizes your concerns, and only reaches out when they need comfort. For months or even years, you try to understand their stress, make excuses for their behavior, and hope they'll eventually change. From their perspective, nothing seems wrong because you've always been there before. Then one day, you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop trying to repair every disconnect. Their confidence disappears almost instantly. Why? Because the pattern they've depended on has been broken. The certainty that you would always return is suddenly replaced by uncertainty. And uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for people who rely on predictable emotional responses from others. Have you ever noticed how someone may ignore your needs for months but become intensely attentive the moment you become emotionally unavailable? That's not necessarily evidence of newfound emotional maturity. More often, it's evidence that the familiar dynamic they depended on has been disrupted. The practical lesson is simple but powerful. Kindness should never be confused with limitless tolerance. Healthy compassion includes boundaries. It allows you to care about someone without sacrificing your own emotional well-being. When your empathy is balanced with self-respect, people learn to value your presence instead of assuming it's guaranteed. And once that assumption disappears, another hidden fear begins to emerge, rooted not in love, but in the loss of influence and control. That's the psychological shift we'll uncover in the next keynote. One of the least understood dynamics in toxic relationships is that the greatest fear is often not loneliness, it's the loss of influence. When someone has become accustomed to shaping your emotions, predicting your reactions, or controlling the direction of every conflict, your emotional independence can feel like a direct threat to them. Influence is subtle. It doesn't always look like obvious manipulation. Sometimes it appears as guilt, silent treatment, unpredictable affection, or constant criticism followed by brief moments of warmth. These patterns create emotional uncertainty, And uncertainty keeps people focused on restoring harmony rather than questioning the relationship itself. Here's what most people completely miss. Toxic individuals often become experts at reading the reactions they've conditioned. They know what words will make you apologize, what behaviors will trigger your empathy, and what emotional buttons will bring you back after an argument. Over time, they stop seeing these responses as choices. They begin seeing them as guarantees, but everything changes when the empath becomes emotionally grounded. Imagine someone who used to respond instantly to every angry message, every accusation, or every emotional outburst. Then, after months of self-reflection, they begin responding calmly, or sometimes not at all. They stop defending themselves against every criticism. They no longer feel the need to win every argument or explain every decision. Their emotional reactions become steady instead of predictable. To the empath, this feels like peace. To the toxic person, it feels like losing control. Have you ever noticed how someone becomes more emotional precisely when you become calmer? That's because calmness removes the leverage that emotional volatility once provided. When you stop reacting in familiar ways, the old strategies stop producing the desired outcome. The relationship dynamic shifts, and the person who depended on those predictable reactions suddenly finds themselves without a reliable way to influence you. The practical lesson is to pay close attention to how someone responds when you set healthy boundaries. Do they respect your decision even if they disagree? Or do they escalate the situation until you question yourself? A healthy partner may feel disappointed, but they adapt with respect. A toxic person often sees boundaries as obstacles to overcome rather than limits to honor. This changes everything because genuine confidence isn't about controlling other people's behavior. It's about managing your own emotional responses. And when an empath reaches that level of self-awareness, the toxic person's deepest insecurity begins to surface. The realization that they are no longer the center of your emotional world. That realization leads us directly into the next psychological principle. One of the most uncomfortable experiences for a toxic person is not being criticized. It's being left alone with their own thoughts. As long as an empath is constantly explaining, comforting, forgiving, or trying to repair the relationship, the focus stays on the interaction between two people. But when the empath emotionally detaches, something unexpected happens. The distraction disappears. Many toxic behavioral patterns survive because attention is always directed outward. Every disagreement becomes someone else's fault. Every disappointment has an external explanation. Every uncomfortable emotion is projected onto another person. This allows difficult feelings like shame, insecurity, or fear of abandonment to remain hidden beneath the surface. But here's where the psychology becomes fascinating. When the empath stops absorbing those projections, the toxic person loses an emotional mirror they relied on. The feelings they once redirected now have nowhere to go. Instead of arguing with someone else, they're forced to sit with emotions they've spent years avoiding. Have you ever noticed how some people become unusually restless after you've stopped engaging with them? They may reach out repeatedly, bring up old conversations, or suddenly revisit issues they previously ignored. From the outside, it can look like they're finally reflecting on the relationship. Sometimes they are, but just as often, they're trying to escape the discomfort of confronting themselves. Consider a relationship where one partner constantly blamed the other for being too sensitive. The empath spent years trying to prove they weren't overreacting, apologizing for emotions that were perfectly valid. Then one day, they simply stopped defending themselves. They accepted that they didn't need everyone's agreement to know how they felt. Without those debates to distract from deeper issues, the toxic partner was left without their usual outlet. That's when unresolved insecurities began surfacing. The practical lesson is to understand that emotional detachment is not the same as emotional coldness. Detachment means refusing to let someone else's unresolved patterns dictate your peace of mind. You can care about another person's well being while recognizing that their personal growth is ultimately their responsibility, not yours. This is an important shift in self awareness. Instead of asking, how can I make them understand me? You begin asking, why do I feel responsible for someone else's emotional work? That single question often marks the beginning of healthier relationships. And once a toxic person realizes they can no longer rely on your emotional energy to avoid their own inner conflicts, another fear emerges, perhaps the deepest one of all. They begin to recognize that they've lost someone who genuinely saw the best in them, and replacing that is far more difficult than they ever imagined. One of the greatest psychological ironies in toxic relationships is that appreciation often arrives too late. While the empath is present, their patience, understanding, and emotional generosity become part of the background. They're so consistently supportive that their efforts stop being noticed. But once they're gone, the absence of those qualities becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings naturally adapt to what they experience repeatedly. Psychologists call this adaptation. When someone receives consistent kindness, they eventually begin treating it as normal instead of exceptional. A toxic person may unconsciously assume that every future relationship will offer the same level of forgiveness, emotional insight, and unconditional support. Then reality proves otherwise. The next person they meet may have healthy boundaries from the beginning. They may communicate clearly, expect accountability, and refuse to tolerate repeated disrespect. Suddenly, behaviors that once carried few consequences now lead to distance, rejection, or the end of the relationship. Here's what most people completely miss. The toxic person often isn't just comparing new partners to old ones. They're comparing the emotional experience. They remember having someone who listened through every frustration, tried to understand every mood, and believed in their potential even during their worst moments. That level of emotional investment is far less common than they assumed. Imagine someone who constantly took an empath's support for granted. Whenever they had a difficult day, they expected comfort. Whenever they made a mistake, they expected forgiveness. But after the relationship ended, they discovered that new people weren't willing to carry the same emotional weight. They were expected to apologize sincerely, communicate honestly, and regulate their own emotions. For the first time, they recognized the value of what they had lost. Have you ever noticed how some people only speak highly of someone after the relationship is over? It's not always because they've changed overnight. Sometimes it's because distance reveals what familiarity concealed. The qualities they once overlooked become obvious only when they're no longer available. The practical lesson for empaths is not to measure your worth by whether someone recognizes it immediately. People who are emotionally healthy appreciate consistency while it's present. People trapped in unhealthy patterns often recognize it only after it's gone. Your empathy is valuable, but it should never come at the expense of your self-respect. The goal isn't to become less compassionate. It's to reserve your compassion for relationships where it's met with gratitude, accountability, and mutual effort. And that leads to the final psychological insight. The greatest fear isn't simply losing an empath. It's realizing that the version of themselves they could have become in a healthy relationship may have disappeared along with that person. By the time an empath has truly decided to leave, something profound has already happened inside them. Their decision isn't usually driven by one dramatic argument or a single act of betrayal. It's the result of countless moments where hope slowly gave way to clarity. They stopped asking, can this person change? And started asking, can I keep losing myself while waiting? This is the moment toxic people often fail to anticipate. They've become so accustomed to the empath's patience that they assume there's always one more conversation, one more apology, or one more chance. But emotional exhaustion works differently. It builds quietly. From the outside, everything may seem normal. On the inside, the empath is gradually disconnecting from the relationship, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Here's where it gets interesting. When the empath finally walks away with calm confidence instead of emotional chaos, the toxic person loses more than a relationship. They lose access to someone who genuinely believed in their potential. Empaths often see possibilities in people that even those people struggle to see in themselves. They encourage growth, celebrate progress, and remain hopeful long after others would have given up. That kind of belief is incredibly rare. Imagine someone who spent years receiving encouragement from a partner who always saw the best in them. Whenever they doubted themselves, the empath reminded them of their strengths. Whenever they failed, the empath focused on what they could learn instead of simply criticizing them. But because that support was always available, they never truly valued it. Only after the relationship ended did they realize how difficult it is to find someone who offers encouragement without expecting perfection. Have you ever noticed that some people begin working on themselves only after losing someone who genuinely cared? Sometimes the loss becomes the first moment they can no longer avoid the truth. They recognize that they didn't lose just another relationship. They lost an opportunity to grow alongside someone who consistently invited them toward a healthier version of themselves. The practical lesson is one every empath should remember. Your purpose is not to rescue people from patterns they refuse to change. Real transformation happens when someone chooses accountability for themselves. You can inspire growth, but you cannot force it. Healthy relationships are built by two people who are both willing to learn, communicate, and take responsibility for their actions. And that brings us to the biggest lesson of this entire discussion. When an empath chooses peace over constant emotional struggle, they're not abandoning someone. They're choosing to stop abandoning themselves. The people who truly value you won't wait until they're about to lose you to show it. They'll demonstrate it consistently through respect, honesty, accountability, and mutual effort. That's the foundation of every healthy relationship. As you move through your own relationships, pay closer attention to patterns than promises. Observe how people respond to your boundaries, how they handle conflict, and whether they take responsibility when things go wrong. Those behaviors reveal far more than words ever can. Most importantly, continue developing your own emotional intelligence and self-awareness. The more you understand human behavior, the less likely you are to confuse inconsistency with love or emotional intensity with genuine connection. Healthy relationships don't require you to constantly prove your worth. They allow you to be valued without sacrificing your peace. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content.